Have you ever noticed how some people only realize your worth after you're gone? Not because they truly loved you, but because your absence removes the mirror they use to avoid their own reflection. They don't miss you. They miss the way you held up their false self, the version of themselves they weren't ready to face. And when you finally walk away, you don't just leave them. You leave behind the illusion they were clinging to. And that, Carl Jung would say, is when the shadow begins to surface. At first it might seem quiet. You leave a relationship, you step out of a dynamic, you stop responding. You think it'll go unnoticed. But something strange happens. They become angry, or they turn cold, or they suddenly act like you were the villain all along. Why? Because your withdrawal wasn't just physical. It broke an emotional contract they never said out loud. You were the stabilizer of their chaos, the emotional trash can, the one who understood even when they never truly tried to understand you. And once you're no longer available to absorb that weight, they feel exposed. It's not love they lost. It's the emotional architecture that collapsed when you stepped away. And in their world, your silence becomes the loudest rejection. Take a moment and ask yourself, what role have you been playing that you never auditioned for? Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything no matter how absurd to avoid facing their own soul." And here's where it gets complicated. When you decide to walk away, you're not just breaking contact, you're breaking projection. Most people don't see you for who you are. They see you for what they need you to be. You became the caretaker, the fixer, the dependable one, the one who always forgives. But the cost of holding that role is this. You slowly disappear. Let me tell you about Stacy. She was the friend everyone called during their 2 a.m. breakdowns, the one who dropped everything to listen to Soothe to Fix. For years, Stacy believed this made her valuable, needed, loved. But what she didn't realize was that she had become an emotional dumping ground. Her friends weren't calling because they cared about her inner world. They called because they knew she would absorb their pain without asking for anything in return. When Stacy finally set a boundary, when she stopped answering those late-night calls, her friends didn't ask if she was okay. They didn't wonder what she needed. They got angry. They called her selfish. They said she had changed, become cold. But Stacy hadn't become cold. She had simply stopped being emotionally available for people who were emotionally unavailable to her. You start to confuse your worth with their comfort. You stay longer than you should. You bend so far, you forget your own shape. And the moment you say, "No more," you trigger their shadow, the inner child in them that felt abandoned, the ego that depended on your emotional compliance. Their pain screams louder than their awareness. So instead of grieving you, they blame you. Instead of thanking you, they resent you. Not because you were cruel, but because you disrupted the illusion. Jung called this projection the unconscious act of seeing in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. When you withdraw, you're no longer holding their disowned parts. You're no longer the container for their unexpressed emotions. And suddenly, they're forced to face what they've been avoiding: their own emptiness, their own need for healing, their own responsibility for their emotional world. This is why walking away feels so threatening to them. It's not about losing you. It's about losing the person who made it possible for them to avoid themselves. Consider this. What parts of yourself have you sacrificed to make others comfortable? But here's what Jung understood that most people don't. The shadow isn't just about them. It's about you too. Because the role you played, the overgiving, the overextending, the constant availability, that wasn't love. That was your own Carl Jung shadow material. The part of you that learned early that your worth was tied to your usefulness. The part that believed love was something you had to earn through endless giving. When you walk away, you're not just triggering their shadow, you're finally facing your own. Here's the truth that cuts to the bone, the realization that changes everything. Your decision to walk away has little to do with them and everything to do with you. It's not about punishing anyone. It's not about revenge or making them suffer. It's about something far more sacred and far more necessary: saving yourself. But that act, that sacred silent self-rescue, forces people to confront something they've long buried, something they've spent years avoiding. The question they don't want to ask is this: who am I without the person who kept me emotionally regulated? Who am I when I can't call someone at 2 a.m. to fix my anxiety? Who am I when I have to sit with my own pain instead of dumping it on someone else? For some people, the answer is unbearable. They may spiral into depression. They may lash out with anger and blame. They may rewrite the entire story of your relationship to cast themselves as the victim and you as the villain who abandoned them in their time of need. But you were never trying to play God. You were never trying to be anyone's savior. You were just trying to be free from the exhausting role of being someone else's emotional lifeline, free from the crushing weight of being responsible for another person's inner peace. Let me share another story. John had been the family peacemaker for 37 years. When his parents fought, which was often he mediated, when his siblings feuded over old wounds and perceived slights, he smoothed things over. When holidays became tense with unspoken resentments and passive-aggressive comments, he was the one who kept everyone laughing, everyone distracted from the underlying dysfunction that no one wanted to address. John never asked for this role. It was thrust upon him as a child, the sensitive one, the empathetic one, the one who could handle the family's emotional chaos. He carried it into adulthood like a cross, believing that his family's stability depended on his ability to absorb their conflicts and transform them into something manageable. His family saw him as the glue that held them together, the one who kept the peace, the problem solver. But what they didn't see, what they didn't want to see, was how much this role was tearing him apart. How he would leave family gatherings emotionally drained, how he would lie awake at night replaying conversations trying to figure out how to fix problems that weren't his to fix. John had become what therapists call the identified patient, the person in a dysfunctional system who carries all the emotional labor, who becomes responsible for everyone else's well-being while their own needs are ignored or minimized. When John finally decided to step back, to stop mediating their conflicts, to stop absorbing their emotional chaos, to stop being the family therapist, his family didn't celebrate his boundary. They didn't say, "Good for you, John. You deserve to have your own life." They panicked. They called him selfish. They said he was abandoning them when they needed him most. They accused him of not caring about the family anymore. Some of them stopped speaking to him entirely, as if his refusal to continue carrying their emotional burdens was a personal betrayal. But here's what Jung would have recognized immediately. John's family wasn't angry because they lost a son and brother. They were angry because they lost their emotional scapegoat, the person who made it possible for them to avoid doing their own inner work, their own healing, their own growth. When John stopped being their emotional sponge, they were forced to feel their own feelings for the first time in decades, to face their own conflicts without a mediator, to take responsibility for their own healing instead of outsourcing it to him. And that terrified them. This is the paradox of walking away. The people who call you selfish for leaving are often the same people who were being selfish by staying. They wanted you to keep sacrificing yourself, your mental health, your energy, your own needs, so they wouldn't have to face themselves. They wanted you to remain small so they could feel big. They wanted you to stay broken so they could feel whole. They wanted you to keep carrying their Carl Jung shadow so they could maintain the illusion that they didn't have one. And for the first time in your life, you chose your peace over your performance. You chose your sanity over their comfort. You chose your healing over their convenience. That's the moment the mask drops, not just theirs, but yours too. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires dismantling who you've been pretending to be. And that dismantling is rarely celebrated by the people who benefited from your pretense. When you finally walk away, you're not just leaving a person or a situation. You're leaving a version of yourself that never really existed. The version that said yes when you meant no, that gave when you were empty, that stayed when you wanted to run, that smiled when you wanted to scream. You're leaving the false self that kept everyone else comfortable while slowly suffocating your true self. You're walking away from the role that made you indispensable to others, but invisible to yourself. The guilt you feel isn't really guilt, it's grief. Grief for the years you spent being someone else's emotional support system while neglecting your own emotional needs. Grief for the parts of yourself you abandoned in order to be accepted, to be needed, to be loved in whatever broken way they were capable of loving. Grief for the dreams you deferred because their crisis was always more urgent than your aspirations. Grief for the boundaries you never set because their comfort was always more important than your well-being. Grief for the words you never spoke because keeping the peace was always more valuable than speaking your truth. But underneath that grief, buried beneath layers of guilt and conditioning and internalized messages about what makes you good, is something radical relief. The relief of finally choosing yourself. The relief of finally saying, "This isn't working for me anymore." The relief of finally honoring the voice inside that has been whispering, then talking, then shouting, "You deserve better," for longer than you care to admit. Take a breath. Feel that relief. That's your soul welcoming you home. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your authentic self, was the most important work of a human life. But individuation requires separation. It requires the courage to disappoint people who expected you to remain the same forever. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood, judged, even vilified by those who preferred you unconscious, compliant, and convenient. Your walk away isn't cruel. It's conscious. It's not selfish. It's self-preserving. It's not abandonment. It's awakening. And that consciousness, that awakening, that's exactly what they can't tolerate. Because your consciousness reflects back to them their own unconsciousness. Your freedom highlights their own imprisonment. Your choice to heal triggers their awareness of how much healing they still need to do. When the dust settles, when the angry phone calls stop, when the guilt trips lose their power, when the people who called you selfish reveal themselves to be the selfish ones, you begin to realize what you were carrying all along. You weren't just showing up for them, you were overextending. You weren't just being supportive, you were being consumed. You weren't just being understanding, you were being used. And the guilt you feel for walking away, that's not your guilt. That's the shadow residue of the role they projected onto you, the emotional programming that told you your worth was contingent on your willingness to sacrifice yourself for others. But now finally, beautifully, terrifyingly, you see it. You see how much energy went into being the good one, the understanding one, the selfless one. You see how exhausting it was to be constantly available, constantly accommodating, constantly putting everyone else's needs before your own. And now you choose something radical, something that feels foreign at first, maybe even wrong. You choose boundaries, not walls. Walls keep everyone out. Boundaries are different. Boundaries are sacred, non-negotiable lines that protect your soul while still allowing authentic connection. This is where the real work begins, because walking away is only the first step. The second step is learning to stay away from dynamics that require you to abandon yourself. The third step is building a life that doesn't require you to dim your light to make others comfortable. Jung talked about the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create new attitudes and solutions by bridging opposites. In your case, it's the bridge between who you were for others and who you're becoming for yourself. It's the integration of your people-pleasing shadow with your authentic self. It's learning to be both loving and boundaried, both generous and self-preserving. You start to notice patterns you couldn't see before, patterns that were invisible when you were caught up in the chaos of constant giving. How you attracted people who needed fixing because fixing others felt easier than fixing yourself. How you stayed in situations that drained you because leaving felt scarier than staying. How you confused being needed with being loved. How you mistook emotional labor for emotional intimacy. You begin to see how your childhood shaped these patterns. Maybe you grew up in a family where love was conditional, where you had to earn affection through good behavior, through meeting other people's needs, through being the easy child who never caused problems. Maybe you learned early that your value came from what you could do for others, not from who you were as a person. Maybe you had a parent who was emotionally unavailable, and you learned to chase that unavailability in your adult relationships. Maybe you had a parent who was overwhelmed, and you became the little adult who tried to fix everything. Maybe you grew up believing that love meant sacrifice, that caring meant suffering, that if you weren't giving everything, you weren't giving enough. But here's what's beautiful about this awakening. You don't become bitter. You become discerning. You don't become cold. You become clear. You don't become selfish. You become selective. You don't become heartless. You become heart smart. You stop explaining yourself to those who never listened. You stop proving yourself to those who only valued what you gave, not who you were. You stop bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand you a bandage when you were wounded. And strangely, that choice doesn't make you hard. It makes you whole. Let me tell you about Rose. After years of being the friend who always said yes, yes to last-minute plans that inconvenienced her, yes to emotional dumping sessions that left her drained, yes to one-sided relationships that gave her nothing in return, Rose finally started saying no. At first, it felt foreign, almost cruel. The word no sat heavy in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she'd never learned. She felt guilty every time she declined an invitation, every time she said she wasn't available to talk, every time she chose her own needs over someone else's wants. But slowly, something shifted. The people who truly cared about her, who saw her as more than just a resource to be used, respected her boundaries. They said things like, "Of course, take care of yourself, and let me know when you're free." They adjusted their expectations and continued to value the relationship. The people who didn't respect her boundaries revealed themselves to be takers, not givers. They got angry when she said no. They made her feel guilty for having limits. They tried to manipulate her back into the old dynamic where she gave everything and received nothing in return. Rose lost some friendships in this process, but what she gained was immeasurable self-respect, the knowledge that she could trust herself to protect her own well-being, the understanding that her worth wasn't contingent on her availability, her value wasn't measured by her usefulness. And gradually, Rose began attracting different people. People who were interested in her thoughts, not just her support. People who could hold space for her struggles, not just dump their own problems on her. People who saw her as a whole person with her own needs, dreams, and limitations, not just a function to be performed. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the importance of psychological development. When you do your inner work, when you integrate your Carl Jung shadow, when you reclaim your projections, when you learn to love yourself enough to protect yourself, you change the entire dynamic of your relationships. You stop being a magnet for people who want to use you and start becoming a magnet for people who want to know you. You stop attracting emotional vampires and start attracting emotional equals. You stop settling for crumbs and start expecting full meals. But this transformation requires you to let go of the old stories, the stories that kept you trapped in unhealthy patterns. The story that says your worth comes from what you do for others. The story that says love means enduring pain without complaint. The story that says setting boundaries makes you a bad person, a selfish person, a person unworthy of love. These stories served a purpose once. They helped you survive in environments where being yourself wasn't safe, where having needs was inconvenient, where setting boundaries was seen as rebellion. But now, they're keeping you from thriving in relationships where being yourself is not only safe, it's required. You begin to see that the people who got angry when you walked away weren't angry because they loved you. They were angry because they lost their emotional supply, their unpaid therapist, their 24/7 support system. And the people who support your boundary setting, who celebrate your self-care, who encourage you to put yourself first, they're the ones who actually see your worth beyond what you can provide. The question isn't whether you'll lose people when you start setting boundaries. You will. The question is, are the people you lose actually people you want to keep? What boundaries have you been afraid to set because you thought they would make you unlovable? In the quiet that follows walking away, there's a sacred kind of grief. Not for the person you left, but for the parts of you that stayed too long. You grieve the version of you that tolerated crumbs, that smiled through disappointment, that accepted conditional love and called it understanding. But in that grief, something gentle begins to rise. You come home to yourself. You remember that you were never too much. You were just in places that made you feel small. This homecoming isn't immediate. It doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds in layers like healing from a deep wound. Some days you feel clear and empowered, certain that you made the right choice. Other days you question everything. Did you overreact? Were you too harsh? Could you have tried harder, given more, been more patient? This doubt is normal. It's your psyche integrating the old with the new, the false self with the authentic self. Jung called this the tension of the opposites, the uncomfortable space between who you were and who you're becoming. The key is not to resolve this tension too quickly, not to rush back into old patterns because they feel familiar, but to sit with the discomfort and let it transform you. You start building new internal architecture, not around being needed, but around being seen. Not around being useful, but around being valuable for who you are, not what you do. You relearn how to trust your gut, that inner voice that tried to warn you long before you were ready to listen. You practice stillness instead of constantly moving to meet other people's needs. You practice saying no without guilt, without over-explaining, without trying to soften the boundary until it becomes meaningless. You practice saying yes without fear, yes to your own needs, yes to your own dreams, yes to relationships that nourish you instead of drain you. And slowly, gradually, like a flower turning toward the sun, you become the kind of person who doesn't need to walk away in silence because you no longer stay too long in situations that diminish you. This is perhaps the most profound shift. You stop ending up in situations that require dramatic exits because you start honoring your inner signals long before they become screams. You notice the red flags because you're no longer colorblind to your own needs. You feel the energy drain because you're no longer numb to your own experience. You develop what Jung might call a healthy relationship with your own shadow, the parts of you that learned to adapt, to please, to shrink in order to survive. Instead of rejecting these parts or feeling ashamed of them, you integrate them with compassion. You understand why they developed what they were trying to protect and how they can serve you in healthier ways. Your nurturing nature doesn't disappear. It becomes more intentional. Instead of giving indiscriminately to anyone who asks, you choose carefully where to invest your emotional energy. Your empathy doesn't vanish. It expands to include yourself. You start extending to yourself the same compassion you've always given to others. Your desire to help others doesn't fade, it becomes balanced with your own needs. You learn to give from overflow instead of depletion, to support others without depleting yourself, to be present for people without losing yourself in their problems. You realize that walking away wasn't the end of your capacity to love. It was the beginning of your capacity to love consciously, to love without losing yourself, to love without needing to be needed, to love from a place of wholeness instead of emptiness. And in this space, this sacred space of self-love and self-respect, something magical happens. You start attracting love that doesn't require you to dim your light, love that celebrates your boundaries rather than testing them, love that sees your whole self, your strengths and your struggles, your light and your shadow, and chooses you anyway. You start attracting people who are interested in your inner world, not just your ability to solve their problems. People who want to know what you think, what you dream, what makes you laugh, what makes you come alive. People who see you as a complete person, not just a role to be filled. But this transformation requires patience with yourself. It requires forgiveness for the years you spent giving your power away. It requires compassion for the parts of you that didn't know any better, that were doing their best with the tools they had. You learn to mother yourself in the ways you needed to be mothered. You learn to protect yourself in the ways you needed to be protected. You learn to validate yourself instead of seeking validation from people who were incapable of giving it. And gradually you realize that the approval you were seeking from others was always meant to come from within. The love you were chasing in unhealthy relationships was always meant to start with self-love. The peace you were trying to create for others was always meant to begin with inner peace. This is the gift of walking away. It forces you to face yourself, to discover who you are when you're not performing for anyone else's comfort. It strips away the false identities and reveals the authentic self that's been waiting underneath all along. And that self, your true self, is worthy of love, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. You deserve relationships that add to your life, not subtract from it. You deserve to be chosen, not just needed. You deserve to be celebrated, not just tolerated. So if you've walked away and the world called you cold or cruel or heartless, I want you to know this. You weren't abandoning anyone. You were returning to yourself. Your absence may have shaken their world, but it was the first time your presence began to nourish your own. Carl Jung taught us that the shadow holds all the parts we disown, and sometimes our departure is the only mirror left for others to face their own. Your walking away might be the greatest gift you give them, the opportunity to discover who they are when they can't use you as an emotional crutch. But more importantly, it's the greatest gift you give yourself, the opportunity to discover who you are when you're not performing for anyone else's comfort. This journey isn't about becoming selfish. It's about becoming whole. It's about learning that self-love isn't the absence of love for others. It's the foundation that makes genuine love possible. When you love yourself enough to walk away from what diminishes you, you create space for what nourishes you. When you respect yourself enough to say no to what drains you, you preserve energy for what fulfills you. When you trust yourself enough to choose your peace over their approval, you discover a kind of inner stability that no external relationship can provide or destroy. Jung wrote, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." Those barriers aren't just the walls you've built to keep others out. They're also the patterns you've built to keep your true self hidden, the people-pleasing, the overgiving, the boundary-less existence that you mistook for love. Walking away strips these barriers down. It forces you to confront the truth. You are worthy of love, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. You deserve relationships that add to your life, not subtract from it. You deserve to be chosen, not just needed. So leave when you must. Speak less when silence is sacred. Protect the peace you fought for. And if this message echoed something you've always felt, but never had words for, I want you to do something powerful. In the comments below, write these words: I walked away to come home to myself. Let that be your declaration, your witness, your commitment to the journey inward. Because this isn't just about walking away. It's about walking inward and finally remembering who you were before the world told you to earn your worth by disappearing. You're not cruel. You're conscious. You're not cold. You're clear. You're not selfish. You're sovereign. And that changes everything. The path you're on, this path of individuation, of becoming who you truly are, it's not an easy one. It requires you to disappoint people, to be misunderstood, to choose your own healing over their comfort, but it's the only path that leads to authentic freedom. And on the other side of that freedom, you'll find something Jung promised was possible. A life where you don't have to choose between being yourself and being loved. A life where your authenticity attracts the kind of love that doesn't require you to abandon your soul. That's the life waiting for you. Not because you walked away from them, but because you walked toward yourself. And that journey home, that sacred return to who you've always been beneath the roles and the masks and the performance, that's the most important journey you'll ever take. Welcome home.